Operation Pied Piper, the British government's effort to protect over 3 million children through voluntary evacuations from English cities prior to and during World War II, has been termed the greatest social upheaval in British history. What responsibility did the British government have to protect their youngest citizens in the face of impending total war? Additionally, did the government have the right to require host families to care for evacuee children? Or was this mass evacuation an irresponsible action that encouraged families to forfeit their parental rights for months, sometimes years? What rights did parents have to protect their own children, and what consequences would follow at war's end, for the British government, for the evacuated children, and for the parents they left behind in the wake of the evacuation order? For millions of parents, this became the day their children were led away. In the late 1930s, Adolf Hitler sought to end the burdens placed on Germany by the Treaty of Versailles. He strengthened the German military and began making territorial demands. Western nations tried to appease Hitler's quest for territory at the Munich Conference in 1938 by agreeing to Nazi demands for the Sudetenland of Czechoslovakia. Despite Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain's promise after Munich of peace for our time, the British government began planning for the evacuation of their citizens from potential bombing sites in preparation for total war. They simultaneously began the relocation of over 10,000 Jewish children from Nazi-occupied territories to England. These kinder transports continued until the formal declaration of war on September 1, 1939. The evacuation plan for children in Britain was directed by a representative from the House of Commons, Sir John Anderson. Anderson was a part of Prime Minister Winston Churchill's war cabinet and, as Minister of Home Security, was given the responsibility for the evacuation, which became known as Operation Pied Piper.
I think the theme of rights and responsibilities is particularly interesting in relation to the evacuation of children during the war. In terms of responsibilities, the government was planning for evacuation from the late 1930s onwards. There was an interesting mixture of voluntarism and compulsion. In that it was voluntary for parents to send their children away. They didn't have to evacuate them if they didn't want to. But on the other hand, it was compulsory for foster parents to take children in the reception areas. And that meant that there were many differences in the proportions of children who were evacuated from various provincial British cities.
The perspective of some parents was that their order infringed on the responsibilities to protect and care for their children themselves, and they simply ignored the order to evacuate. However, those parents choosing to follow the evacuation order had a different perspective. Their view was that the British government was showing a greater responsibility to protect their citizens in a time of national emergency. On Thursday, August 31, 1939 at 11 in the morning, the order for parents to bring their children to predetermined locations for evacuation was broadcast across the BBC. The children wore labels which identified them, including their name, school, and destination. The next day, Adolf Hitler violated the Munich Agreement when the German army invaded Poland and World War II formally began. In addition to London, other industrial and more populated cities such as Liverpool and Manchester were evacuated. Evacuees were transported from cities and industrial centers and relocated to the relative safety of the countryside.
Similarly, many middle-class parents took responsibility for the evacuation of their own children, and about 2 million children were evacuated privately at the outbreak of the war.
My father was called up in the army, and that's when I went to live in Warminster in Wiltshire as a privately evacuated little girl.
Over the course of that first week of World War II, approximately 1/4 of the British population would be relocated. To this day, it remains the largest mass movement of people in the history of the United Kingdom.
The government was under pressure to get this right. They wanted to avoid the unrestrained and disorganised mass exodus of parents from the urban centres trying to protect their children. It raised inevitable conflicts between parents and government officials. Parental choice and responsibility for decisions made about their children were effectively removed.
The anxiety of war, the trauma of separation, and the pain of isolation overshadowed busy train stations, shouting officials, and crying mothers. John Allpress, an evacuee at age 10, recalled,
"It was an absolute tragedy that I was being taken away. I just couldn't understand it. Why have I got to leave my family?" There we were, all herded away in these buses, 40 miles from London, but it was the other end of the earth at that age.
The evacuation That stupendous undertaking of those grave September days being now an accomplished fact, we find children sampling the adventure of life in new homes which the hospitality of country people has provided for them.
Roughly half of those ordered to evacuate went to their designated areas, while the remaining half exerted their individual rights to disregard the government order and take personal responsibility for their children's safety. As the first few months of war passed without attack, British officials were faced with a growing problem. The evacuees began returning to their homes. 900,000 of the 1.5 million evacuees returned to the cities. Propaganda posters and films attempted to stem the tide of those returning. Those children who had returned to their families were evacuated a second time, when on September 7, 1940, the bombing of British cities began.
We would hear the sirens go off and we knew we could hear them coming. We could hear the planes coming. We knew which ones were, which had the bombs and which were the escort planes.
The German Luftwaffe had dropped more than 100 tons of high explosives on 16 British cities for almost 37 weeks. Those who chose not to evacuate London took shelter in the underground rail stations known as the Tube. During the 8 months of the Blitz, 43,000 civilians were killed, including over 5,000 children.
When the doodlebugs and the rockets started coming, people would bring their children down to different towns and things like that, practically begging people to take their children in because it was so horrific in London.
Not all children were sent to the British countryside. Nearly 3,000 children from England were sent across the Atlantic Ocean by the Children's Overseas Reception Board. However, tragedy would end this program when on September 17, 1940, the transport ship City of Benares, bound for Canada, was torpedoed and sunk by a German submarine. 83 of the 90 Corps children were killed. As a result, overseas evacuation was halted. As the war in Europe came to a close, the evacuee children returned to their homes, and the responsibility for their safety once again returned to their parents.
Because now the war was over, and Mrs. Ellaway, she told me, she said, now your daddy will be coming, your daddy will be coming one day.
Unfortunately, many children returned home only to face years of emotional obstacles.
Educational issues, bearing in mind that that whole generation missed out on their education to some extent. The impact of separation, both on the children and on their parents, and to some extent on the hosts who then had to give up these children at the end of the war, having lovingly looked after them for 5 years.
She told me years later that I would cry for my mother and my father when I was first there with her.
The evacuation has been the setting for contemporary films and inspired novels such as C.S. Lewis' Chronicles of Narnia, Nina Boden's Carrie's War, and William Golding's Lord of the Flies. Unfortunately, the tragedy of children maimed or killed in war remains, often in developing nations such as the Central African Republic and Syria, where children often become casualties. Though military strategists in most developed nations attempt to avoid non-combatants, we still read of children caught in the fog of war. While most developed nations such as the United States have detailed plans for regional evacuation procedures based on the nature of the emergency, the world has yet to again witness a nation balance its rights and responsibilities in a time of war by organizing an evacuation of children such as Operation Pied Piper. How does a nation balance government responsibility and individual rights? Under what wartime circumstances should parental rights be limited? The British government achieved that elusive balance in the face of total war by giving its families choices. By not making the order mandatory, parents were able to ultimately decide how best to protect their children. Though neither choice by parents was without consequences, Operation Pied Piper serves as a testament to the coexistence between a government's responsibility to protect its citizens and a parent's right to maintain their children's safety. Never repeated, and possibly never to be seen again, it is also a reminder that beyond the rights of the individual, there is perhaps a greater responsibility by government to defend the nation, to ensure citizen safety, and to secure a future for its children.
Let us therefore brace ourselves to our duty, so bear ourselves that if the British Empire and its commonwealths last for 1,000 years, men will still say, this was their finest hour.